please.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's truly a great pleasure to participate in this year's annual China and Globalization Forum. I would like to extend my gratitude to the Center for China and Globalization for the invitation. I would like to offer a few thoughts on China's role in global trade, but my remarks will be less on trade in goods, which is all too well known, but I'd like to focus more on China's role in services trade, a facet lesser known to many. China's branding as the factory of the world often hides its rising prominence in services trade. China is the world's largest trading nation, a position it gained more than a decade ago. The reforms that led to China's WTO accession 20 years ago initially brought access to foreign capital and technology, which rapidly translated into growing export competitiveness, which in turn increased the demand for commodities and intermediate inputs, making China today the largest trading partner for the majority of the WTO's 164 member countries. So clearly, China is a crucial market for many countries, including many developing countries. This became apparent in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, when China's large domestic stimulus triggered a boom in commodities that helped the developing world emerge from the crisis far quicker than the advanced economies. Policymakers in China have repeatedly emphasized that in a consumption-based growth model, the services sector will need to assume a greater importance. A recent report by the World Bank titled "At Your Service, the Promise of Service-Led Development" shows that services are increasingly driving economic transformation. In fact, half of workers in low and middle income countries are currently employed in the services sector, and they have become more productive since the 1990s. China has made major strides in boosting the size and performance of its domestic service sector. Sustained gains in income capital levels, demographic changes, and rapid urbanization all explain the rising importance of the domestic services market. Services accounted for just under 55% of China's GDP in 2020, up from 44% a decade earlier. While the pace of change has been rapid relative to other countries, and services in China are now the leading source of employment, particularly of female workers, China's service sector still has significant room to grow. The sector remains relatively small for its income per capita, reflecting the continued dominance of export-led manufacturing. With the rise of the services sector across economies, the world's trade structure too has been changing. Services today comprise a growing proportion of nations' trade baskets, with varying impacts on their current account balance. Trade and services can assume many forms, including international transactions, as varied as a consumer buying a foreign movie to watch on a computer, or a supermarket chain selling products through a foreign branch. Despite its growing importance, trade and services sometimes receive less airtime in conversations on global trade, yet account for the majority of trade in many developed economies and are playing an increasingly important role for many developing economies as well. This is perhaps because services are less tangible, often require real-time interaction between service providers and consumers, and are subject to complex layers of regulatory oversight. China's services trade integration has deepened steadily over the past decade. As the world's third largest exporter of services, China's exports of services stood at about $145 billion in the first 4 months of this year. This marks an increase by almost 30% from the same period last year. Similarly, China is also the second largest importer of services globally. Its service imports reached around $150 billion year to date, a 20% increase from the same period last year. China's rising services trade growth and the greater sectoral diversity of its services reflects its status as the world's leading supplier of manufactured goods and the goods services linkages that flow from China's manufacturing prowess. Technology has been a key factor in expanding services trade, but technology alone will not be enough to reap the full rewards of services trade. While China has made much progress in opening services market in recent years, for example, by revising the negative list on foreign investment, Limitations continue to prevail and are found on restrictions to foreign entry, limitations on cross-border data flows, barriers to competition, and restrictions on the movement of people. These in turn contribute to the suboptimal performance of China's service sector. So how can policymakers lay the foundation for a more dynamic and modern service sector? The short answer is through pro-competitive policies, developing the skills base and human capital, and regulatory reforms. Lowering barriers to services trade and opening key services sectors to foreign providers would encourage competition, drive innovation, and productivity growth, both of which are key to facilitating the process of economic transformation in China. It would also ensure Chinese consumers and producers have access to higher quality and lower cost services. Addressing restrictions in the country's data governance framework for qualified services to engage in cross-border data transfers would open up opportunities for services exports and imports. Reducing restrictive barriers and services will require parallel reforms in regulatory governance, not least to reduce levels of regulatory uncertainty often identified by both foreign and domestic investors as critical for sustainable business operations in China. China can also demonstrate leadership in advancing services trade liberalization at the regional and global level. China's 14th five-year plan, which devotes considerable attention to the services sector and to services trade, are important signals that service liberalization is high on the authorities' agenda. The RCEP, which we just heard about, and China's application to join CPTPP offer important platforms to advance deeper commitments in areas including services liberalization, digital trade, and intellectual property. To conclude, China's own role in the global economy has continued to grow in the past 2 decades. With such growth comes new responsibilities. Just as China benefited from open markets in other countries, it has become increasingly important as a market for others. It is vital that China's market opens further so that the benefits of cross-border trade and investment continue to spread to other countries. This will benefit Chinese consumers just as China's exports have benefited consumers around the world. And it will allow Chinese producers to move further up the value chain. Thank you very much.